The story is from Iceland. It happened a long time ago, around the year 1000. It starts with a woman named Guðrún Ósvífursdóttir. She was said to be the most beautiful woman of her time. Two men loved her. One was Kjartan Ólafsson, the other was Bolli Thorleiksson. Kjartan and Bolli were not just rivals. Well, they were foster brothers raised together closer than blood. Kjartan was bold and bright, he was the star of the region, Bolli was quieter, always in Kjartan's shadow. Both were great warriors. Guðrún loved Kjartan, but she was also drawn to Bolli. A prophecy said she would have 4 husbands, and her life would be filled with sorrow. Kjartan decided to travel to Norway to make his name. He planned to be gone for 3 years. He asked Guðrún to wait for him. He made her promise. But he did not formally betroth himself to her. This was a mistake. While he was gone, Bolli stayed in Iceland. He was always near Guðrún. He told her stories of Kjartan's success in Norway, but also hinted that Kjartan might not return. He said Kjartan was close to the king's sister, a great princess. The stories worked. Guðrún felt abandoned. Bolli, pushed by his own desires and by Guðrún's family, proposed marriage. Guðrún agreed. They were married, and when Kjartan returned to Iceland a year later, he was a famous man. He brought back gifts and honor, and he found the woman he loved married to his own foster brother. The betrayal cut deep. Kjartan could not let it go. He felt his honor was stained. He married another woman, Hrefna, but it was a marriage of spite. The bitterness between the two farms grew. It started with small things. Kjartan invited Bolli and Guðrún to a feast, but gave them seats of low honor. Then Guðrún, feeling slighted, convinced one of her kinsmen to steal a precious sword that Kjartan had been given by the king of Norway. This was a direct attack on Kjartan's reputation. Kjartan retaliated. He and his men ambushed Bolli's farm. They didn't kill anyone. Instead, they held Bolli and Guðrún and all their people hostage for 3 days. They forced them to stay inside their own home, unable to work or even use the outhouse. This was a profound humiliation in a society built on pride. It was a public shaming. Guðrún could not bear the shame. She told her husband Bolli that he was a coward if he did not wash away the insult with blood. She told her brothers the same. She worked on them for months. Finally, they agreed. They laid an ambush for Kjartan. Bolli did not want to go. He loved Kjartan still, but the pressure from his wife and his own wounded honor was too much. In the spring of 1003, they cornered Kjartan by a river. Kjartan fought fiercely. He killed several of Guðrún's brothers. At the end, he was left facing Bolli. Kjartan threw down his weapon. He told Bolli he would rather be killed by him than kill him. Bolli hesitated, but Guðrún's brothers shouted at him, calling him weak. Bolli thrust his sword, and his foster brother Kjartan fell dead in his arms. This act did not end the feud. It was only the beginning. Kjartan's father and brothers demanded vengeance. They could have taken money, a payment called wergild, but the insult was too great. The love and betrayal were too deep. They wanted blood for blood. A few years later, Kjartan's brothers hunted down Bolli and killed him. And still, it was not over. Guðrún was now a widow. She had 2 sons with Bolli. Their names were Bolli Bollason and Thorleik. As they grew up, she told them the story. She showed them the bloody shirt their father was wearing when he was killed. She kept the memory of the killing alive. When her sons were grown men, she sent them out. She told them their duty was clear. Things they had to avenge their father around the year 1029, more than 25 years after Kjartan was killed. Guðrún's sons finally found their moment. They tracked down Helgi Hardbeinsson, one of the men who had helped kill their father, and they killed him. The cycle of revenge continued, spinning across decades, pulling in new generations. It was a fire that could not be put out. It was fueled by more than just anger. It was fueled by a complex web of honor, law, family, and memory. And stopping it was nearly impossible. Number 20, a chieftain was not a king. In the year 963, a man named Thorolf Mostrarskegg fled Norway. He was a chieftain, a powerful man who followed the old ways. The king of Norway, Harald Fairhair, was consolidating his power. He was forcing chieftains to submit to his rule. Thorolf refused. He and his followers set sail for a new land they had heard about. They set sail for Iceland. When they arrived, Thorolf established a community on a fjord. He built a temple. He acted as the priest and the local leader, the Godi. His power came directly from the farmers and warriors who lived on the land around him. They were his thingmen, his followers. They gave him their loyalty, and in return, he gave them his protection and his judgment. But here is the crucial part. Thorolf was not a king. He had no army to enforce his will. He had no tax collectors. He had no police force. His authority rested on a fragile agreement. His thingmen followed him because they chose to. If he seemed weak, or if he failed to support one of his followers in a dispute, that follower could simply change his allegiance. He could go to another Godi, another chieftain in a neighboring valley, and pledge his loyalty there. This system created a permanent state of competition among the chieftains. A Godi's power was measured by the number of men who followed him. Losing even one follower was a blow to his prestige and his influence at the regional assemblies, and at the Great National Assembly, the Elthing. This meant a chieftain was often forced to support his followers, even when they were in the wrong. Consider the case of Snorri Goði, one of the most famous and cunning chieftains in Icelandic history. He lived in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Snorri was a master of politics and law. His story is told in the Eyrbyggja saga. On one occasion, one of Snorri's followers, a man named Thorod, got into a dispute with his powerful neighbors, the Thorbrandsons. The dispute was over a woman, but it escalated quickly. Men were killed on both sides. Snorri knew the Thorbrandsons were dangerous and had many allies. A wise leader might have tried to broker a peace immediately, perhaps by paying compensation or forcing his own man to back down. But Snorri couldn't do that. If he failed to back Thorod, he would look weak. His other followers would see that Snorri Goði did not protect his own. They might start to wonder if their loyalty was misplaced. Another Goði, perhaps Snorri's rival Uncle Goði, would be happy to take them on. So Snorri had to support Thorod. This meant he was now formally part of the feud. He led his men in attacks. He prosecuted the case at the local thing. He turned a small conflict between two men into a regional war between two powerful clans, led by two competing chieftains. He did this not out of personal hatred for the Thorbrandsons, but out of political necessity. His power depended on it. This lack of a central, unquestioned authority was the bedrock upon which feuds were built. There was no higher power to appeal to. There was no king who could command the fighting to stop. There was no state that held a monopoly on violence. Violence was a tool available to everyone, and for a chieftain, supporting his followers' use of violence was part of the job. It was how he maintained his status. A feud wasn't just a private matter, it was a political one, and a chieftain who abandoned his followers in a feud would soon find himself a chieftain with no followers at all. Number 19. The law could start a fight, not just end one. The Icelanders were proud of their legal system. Around 930, they established the Althing, a national assembly held every summer. It was one of the world's first parliaments. At the Althing, chieftains and farmers from all over the country would gather. They would trade goods, arrange marriages, and, most importantly, settle disputes. The laws were not written down at first. They were memorized and recited by a law speaker. The law code, later written down as the Grágás or Grey Goose laws, was incredibly detailed. It had rules for everything: land ownership, inheritance, marriage, insults, theft, and killing. The system was designed to replace blood feuds with legal settlements. If a man was killed, his family could bring a case against the killer at the thing. A panel of judges would hear the arguments. If the killer was found guilty, he would be ordered to pay a compensation, the wergild. The amount varied depending on the status of the man who was killed. A free farmer was worth more than a freed slave. A chieftain was worth more than a farmer. The idea was to make things right with money instead of with swords. But the system had a fatal flaw. The Althing had a legislative branch and a judicial branch, but it had no executive branch. There was no police force to arrest a guilty man. There was no state power to force him to pay the fine he was ordered to pay. Enforcing the verdict was left to the winner of the case and his family. This is where things went wrong. The story of Njal Thorgerson from Njal's saga is the ultimate example. Njalgjal lived in the late 10th century and was the most respected legal mind in Iceland. People came from all over the country to ask for his advice. His best friend was a great warrior named Gunnar Hamundarson. Gunnar was honest and brave, but he often found himself in trouble. Time and again, Gunnar was involved in killings that started feuds. And time and again, his friend Njal would use his brilliant legal skills to find a settlement. He would argue the cases at the Althing. He would arrange for compensation to be paid. He would get both sides to shake hands and swear oaths of peace. But the peace never lasted. In one famous case, Gunnar killed a man named Thorgeir Otkelsson. It was a fair fight, but it was still a killing. And Njal managed to negotiate a settlement. A huge sum of silver was to be paid, but as the silver was being handed over, Thorgeir's kinsman, Mord Valgardsson, who hated Gunnar, made an insulting comment about Gunnar's father. The deal collapsed. The feud was back on. Later, Gunnar was involved in another series of killings. This time, his enemies prosecuted him at the Althing. Njal tried his best, but the case was too strong. Gunnar was convicted. The sentence was not death, but lesser outlawry for 3 years. This meant he had to leave Iceland for 3 years. If he stayed, anyone could kill him without legal penalty. Gunnar prepared to leave. He said his goodbyes and rode away from his farm, Hlíðarendi. But as he looked back at his home, the fields were so green and the hillside so beautiful, he could not bring himself to go. He turned his horse around. He told his companions, "Fair is the hillside. I have never seen it look so fair. I will not ride away. I will stay here." By choosing to stay, he turned his 3-year sentence into full outlawry. He was now a man with a price on his head. His enemies gathered their forces and surrounded his farmhouse. Gunnar fought them off alone, but his bowstring broke. He asked his wife Hallgerd for a lock of her hair to repair it. She refused, reminding him of a slap he had once given her. Without his bow, Gunnar was overwhelmed and killed. The law had provided a sentence, but the law had no power to make Gunnar accept it. The enforcement was a private matter, and because Gunnar defied the verdict, the feud didn't end in a courtroom. It ended with an armed assault on his home. The legal system, for all its complexity and sophistication, was often just a prelude to more violence. A guilty verdict could feel like an insult to the losing party. It could harden their resolve. It could make them feel that violence was the only option left. The law, which was meant to stop feuds, often became just another weapon in the fight. Number 18 words were as sharp as any axe. In Viking Age Iceland, a person's reputation was their most valuable possession. It was called honor, or drengskapur. It was a mixture of courage, generosity, honesty, and the willingness to stand up for oneself and one's family. If a man with great honor was respected, a man with no honor was worthless, and nothing could destroy a man's honor faster than a well-aimed insult. Insults were not just casual remarks, they were public challenges, they were a form of social violence. And the Icelanders were masters of it. The worst kind of insult was called a nid. This was a form of slander that often involved accusations of cowardice or sexual transgression. To accuse a man of being the passive partner in a homosexual relationship, for example, was the gravest insult imaginable. It implied he was unmanly, weak, and womanish. The law even stated that a man was legally justified in killing someone who made such an accusation against him. Poetry was a particularly powerful vehicle for insult. A skilled poet, a skald, could craft verses that were witty, memorable, and devastating. These verses would spread like wildfire through the community. They would be repeated at feasts and gatherings. The target of the poem would be shamed wherever he went. Egil Skallagrimsson, the famous warrior poet of the 10th century, was a master of the insulting verse. Egil's saga tells his story. He was a complex man, capable of great loyalty and savage violence. He once felt he had been cheated out of an inheritance by a Norwegian king, Eric Bloodaxe. And Egil's response was not just to fight, it was to use his words. Before he fled Norway, Egil went to an island. He took a horse's head and fixed it on top of a tall hazel pole. He turned the horse's gaping mouth towards the mainland. Then he carved runes on the pole and spoke a formal curse, a powerful form of Nid. He directed his curse not just at King Eric and his queen, but at the very land spirits of Norway, demanding they drive the king from his own country. This was a supernatural and poetic declaration of war. It was a deep and lasting insult to the king's honor and his right to rule. But insults didn't have to be so dramatic. They could be subtle. In Njal's saga, the feud between the families of Njal and Gunnar is constantly stoked by the insults of their wives, Bergthora and Hallgerd. At a feast, Hallgerd makes a comment about Bergthora's husband, Njal, who has no beard. She calls him Old Beardless. It's a small jibe, but it questions his manhood. Bergthora fires back, insulting Hallgerd's first husband. This exchange of words sets off a deadly chain of events. Bergthora, defending her husband's honor, has one of Hallgerd's servants killed. Hallgerd, in turn, has one of Bergthora's servants killed. This escalates back and forth, with each woman goading her kinsman to avenge the latest killing. The husbands Njal and Gunnar are friends. They try to stop it. After each killing, they meet and pay compensation to each other. They try to smooth things over, but the public insults of their wives make it impossible. The honor of their households is at stake. They are dragged into the feud against their will, all because of a few sharp words spoken at a feast. An insult was not something you could just ignore. To ignore an insult was to accept it as true. It was an admission of weakness. Your friends and neighbors would see you as a coward. Your reputation would be ruined. The social pressure to respond was immense, and the most common response was violence. A slanderous poem or a cutting remark could not be erased. The only way to restore your honor was to silence the person who spoke it. In a world without libel laws, the axe was the final arbiter of truth. Number 17, revenge, was a family business. In the Icelandic Commonwealth, the individual was never truly alone. A person's identity was tied to their family, their kin group. Or your family was your social safety net, your business partners, and your private army. If you were attacked, it was not just an attack on you. It was an attack on your entire family, and the duty to respond fell on all your relatives. This duty of vengeance was absolute. It was the core of the honor system. If your brother was killed, it was your obligation to either seek revenge by killing the murderer or one of his close kinsmen, or to secure a massive payment of wergild. To do nothing was unthinkable. It would bring shame upon your entire family for generations. You would be seen as weak and unworthy. The obligation extended across the family tree. It fell on fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, and cousins. The closer the blood relationship, the stronger the duty. A son was expected to avenge his father. A brother was expected to avenge a brother. This is why feuds rarely ended with a single killing. A killing created a debt of blood, and that debt had to be paid. The story of Gisli Sursun from Gisla Saga is a tragic illustration of this principle. The saga takes place in the western fjords of Iceland in the mid-10th century. Gisli and his brother Thorkel are married to two sisters, Odd and Asgerd. They are also blood brothers with their brother-in-law Vestein. It is a tight-knit family group. The trouble starts when Thorkel overhears his wife Asgerd confessing to a past affair with Vestein, his own blood brother. Thorkel is consumed by jealousy and a sense of betrayal. He feels his honor has been compromised. Secretly, he arranges for Vestein to be murdered. Vestein is killed in his bed at night with a spear. Gisli is devastated. Vestein was his sworn brother and his dearest friend. He knows he has a sacred duty to avenge him, but he suspects the killer is his own brother, Thorkel. He is trapped. His duty to his slain blood brother is in direct conflict with his loyalty to his own flesh and blood. For Gisli, the duty of vengeance is stronger. He cannot let the killing go unanswered. He secretly kills the man he believes carried out the murder for Thorkel. But this act makes him an outlaw. He is forced to flee into the wilderness. For 13 years he lives as a fugitive, hunted by his enemies, including his own brother-in-law. His family is torn apart. His sister Thordis, who was married to the man Gisli killed, actively works against him. She pushes her new husband to hunt Gisli down. The feud has shattered the family from within. The bonds of kinship, which were supposed to be a source of strength, have become a web of conflicting obligations and hatred. Gisli is eventually cornered and killed in a heroic last stand, but the feud doesn't die with him. Even after his death, his followers continue the fight, seeking to avenge him. The original crime, the killing of Vestine, has spawned a chain reaction of revenge killings that spans more than a decade and destroys an entire family. This was the terrible logic of the family-based feud. An attack on one was an attack on all, and the responsibility for revenge was shared. It was a sacred trust passed from father to son. It meant that a man could be drawn into a deadly conflict over a slight that happened before he was even born. The feud was not a personal choice. It was an inheritance. Number 16, women were the keepers of the grudge. In Viking Age society, men held the swords and spoke at the thing. They were the public actors in the drama of the feud. But women often wrote the script. They could not fight or prosecute a case in court, but they wielded a different kind of power. They were the guardians of family honor and memory, and they were experts at goading their men into action. This practice was known as eggvetja, or incitement. A woman's honor was tied to the honor of her male relatives, her father, her husband, her brothers, and her sons. If they were insulted or harmed, her own status was diminished. She could not personally take revenge, so she used the most powerful tool she had, her words. She would shame the men of her family for their inaction. She would question their courage. She would remind them day after day of the wrongs that had been done. We saw this with Guðrún Ósvífursdóttir, who pushed her husband and brothers to kill Kjartan, and later pushed her sons to avenge their father. Her story is not unique. The sagas are filled with powerful women who refuse to let a grudge die. Hildegun in Njal's saga is another stark example. She was the niece of a powerful chieftain named Flosi. She was married to a man named Hoskuld, who was Injal's foster son. Here Hoskuld was a good and peaceful man, but he was murdered by Injal's sons due to the manipulations of the villainous Mord Valgardsson. When Hildegun found her husband's body lying in a pool of blood, she did not just weep. She acted. She took the cloak that Flosi had given Hoskuld as a gift. She let it soak up her husband's blood. Then she folded it carefully and put it away. Later, her uncle Flosi arrived. He offered to help her, to pursue the case legally, to get a good settlement. Hildegun was silent. After everyone had eaten, she went to her chest and took out the bloody cloak. She walked up to Flosi and threw it over his shoulders. The clotted blood rained down on him. Then she spoke. She told him he had given this cloak to Hoskuld. Now she was giving it back. She told him it was his duty to avenge the blood that had stained it. She invoked God and all the saints, demanding that he avenge all of Hoskuld's wounds, or be shamed in the eyes of every man. Flosi was a reasonable man. He had not wanted a blood feud with Njal's family, but this was a challenge he could not refuse. His own kinswoman had publicly shamed him and charged him with the duty of revenge. His honor was on the line. He ripped the cloak off himself and said, "You want us to take the course that will be worst for all of us. And so it shall be." Because of Hildegun's act, the chance for a peaceful settlement was lost. Flosi gathered 100 men. They rode to Enjal's farm at Bergtorsfall. They surrounded the house and set it on fire. They killed Enjal, his wife Bergthora, and all of their sons inside. The burning of Njal, one of the most infamous events in the sagas, was the direct result of a woman's refusal to accept anything less than blood for blood. Women like Hildegun and Guðrún were not simply emotional, they were strategic. They understood the codes of honor better than anyone. They knew exactly what to say and do to force their men's hands. They acted as the conscience of the feud, the living memory of the wrong. They held on to the bloody cloak, literally and figuratively, ensuring that the debt of vengeance would never be forgotten. Number 15, land was more than just dirt and grass. In the agricultural society of Viking Age Iceland, land was everything. It was the source of wealth, status, and survival. A man's power was measured by the size and quality of his farm. Land produced the grass that fed the sheep and cattle, which in turn provided wool, milk, and meat. A good farm meant a strong household. A landless man was a nobody. Disputes over land were therefore incredibly common and fiercely contested. These were not simple arguments over a few feet of fence line. They were struggles over the very foundation of a family's existence and prestige. A conflict over a hayfield or a patch of woodland could easily escalate into a multi-generational blood feud. The Erbygja saga, which chronicles the lives of the people in the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, begins with a series of land disputes. When the first settlers arrived from Norway, there was plenty of land to go around. A chieftain would claim a large territory for himself and his followers. But as the population grew over the next few generations, the land filled up. Good grazing land became scarce. For boundaries that were once vague became points of bitter contention. One of the central conflicts in the saga is between the clans of Snorri and Arnkel. The conflict starts small, with a dispute over some woodland. A man named Thorir, one of Arnkel's followers, owned a piece of forest next to the land of Thorleif, one of Snorri's followers. Thorleif's slaves went into Thorir's woods and began cutting down trees for firewood. Thorir caught them and killed them. This was not just about a few trees, it was about rights and resources. Thorleif, backed by Snorri, demanded compensation for his dead slaves. Thorir, backed by Arnkel, refused, arguing the slaves were thieves. The case went to the local thing. But the legal process failed to produce a clear resolution. The feud simmered, it expanded beyond the two original parties. It became a proxy war between the two most powerful chieftains in the region, Snorri and Arnkel. Other disputes got drawn in. There was an argument over a beached whale, a valuable source of meat and oil. There was a conflict over grazing rights on a common pasture. Each small conflict added more fuel to the fire. The climax came when Arnkel, the powerful chieftain, was working on his farm with only a few men. Snorri, and his followers saw their chance. They ambushed Arnkel and killed him. It was a major event. Arnkel was one of the most respected men in Iceland. His death sent shockwaves through the community, but it didn't end the feud. It guaranteed it would continue. Arnkel's kinsmen were now honor-bound to avenge him. The cycle of violence, which had started with a few stolen trees, had now claimed the life of a major chieftain and ensured that the conflict between the two clans would last for another generation. Land was not a simple commodity. It was tied to family history, identity, and honor. A farm was often the same land that a family's great-grandfather had first claimed when he arrived in Iceland. To lose that land or to have one's rights to it challenged was an insult to one's ancestors and a threat to one's descendants. People were willing to die to protect their hayfield or their access to a stream because they weren't just protecting a piece of property. They were protecting their family's past and its future. Number 14, outlawry, was a death sentence in slow motion. The Icelandic legal system had two main punishments for serious crimes like killing. One was to pay compensation. The other was outlawry. Outlawry was in many ways a more terrible fate than a quick execution. It stripped a person of all their legal rights and protections. An outlaw was a wolf in sacred places. He was no longer considered a member of society. There were two kinds of outlawry. A lesser outlawry, as we saw with Gunnar Hamundarson, meant you had to leave Iceland for 3 years. Full outlawry was a life sentence. A man declared a full outlaw had his property confiscated. He could be killed by anyone, at any time, without any legal consequence. In fact, the person who killed a known outlaw was often rewarded. The outlaw's former neighbors had a duty to hunt him down. To help an outlaw, to give him food or shelter, was a serious crime in itself. This system was designed to remove troublesome individuals from the community without the need for a state executioner. But in practice, it often made feuds worse. An outlawed man did not simply disappear. He became a desperate fugitive. He would flee to the highlands, the uninhabited interior of Iceland. He would live in caves, surviving by stealing sheep and avoiding human contact. The life of Grettir the Strong, the hero of Grettir's saga, is the most famous story of an outlaw. Grettir was a difficult and aggressive man, but he was also incredibly strong and capable of great heroism. Early in his life, he was unfairly blamed for a fire that killed several men in Norway. He was declared an outlaw in both Norway and Iceland. For nearly 20 years, Grettir lived as a fugitive in his own country. He was constantly hunted. Men seeking fame and fortune would try to kill him. Farmers whose sheep he stole would band together to attack him. Every encounter he had with other people was fraught with danger and usually ended in more violence. He killed many of the men who came after him. Each killing added to his fearsome reputation and made people more determined to be rid of him. Outlawry turned a man into a cornered animal. Grettir had no way to clear his name. He had no legal recourse. His only option was to fight to survive. His existence as an outlaw perpetuated a cycle of violence. He had to steal to eat, which created new enemies. He had to kill to defend himself, which created new kinsmen who were now honor-bound to avenge their dead relative. The system also created a class of professional bounty hunters. These were men who would take on the task of killing an outlaw for a price. This commercialized the process of vengeance and introduced new players into the feud who had no personal connection to the original dispute. At the end of his life, Grettir was sick and weak. He was living on the remote island of Drangi with his brother and a slave. A man named Thorbjorn Angle, whose kinsman Grettir had killed, sought to finally bring him down, but he couldn't do it in a fair fight. So he used sorcery. A witch cursed the island, causing Grettir to wound himself badly with his own axe. Only then could Thorbjorn and his men overcome and kill the legendary outlaw, but even Grettir's death did not end the feud. Grettir's half-brother, Thorstein, felt duty-bound to avenge him. He traveled all the way to Constantinople, where Thorbjorn had fled, and killed him there. The status of outlawry meant to end a conflict by removing a person from society, instead created a desperate, lonely war that could last for decades and cross thousands of miles. It didn't solve the problem of violence, it just pushed it into the wilderness. Number 13 fosterage made a tangled web of loyalties. In the Viking Age, it was common for a child, especially the son of a chieftain, to be sent to live in another household for several years. This was called fosterage. The child would be raised by a foster father, often alongside the foster father's own children. This created a powerful bond, not just between the child and his foster parents, but between the foster siblings as well. The bond of fosterage was considered as strong, and sometimes stronger, than the bond of blood. A man had a deep obligation to his foster father and his foster brothers. He was expected to support them in disputes, to fight alongside them, and to avenge them if they were killed. On the surface, fosterage was a way to build alliances and create peace. A chieftain would foster the son of another chieftain to seal a treaty or to create a bond of friendship between their families. It was a form of social glue, weaving different kin groups together. But this tangled web of loyalties could also make feuds much more complicated and difficult to stop. A man could find himself caught in the middle of a conflict between his birth family and his foster family. His loyalties would be horribly divided. You know, the story of Kjartan and Bolli, which began this discussion, is a perfect example of this. They were cousins, but more importantly, they were foster brothers, raised in the same household by Kjartan's father, Olaf the Peacock. This should have made their bond unbreakable. For most of their lives, it did. They were inseparable. But when their rivalry over Guðrún erupted, the bond of fosterage was put under an unbearable strain. When Bolli married Guðrún while Kjartan was away, it was a betrayal not just of a friend, but of a foster brother. This made the insult much deeper, and when Guðrún's brothers pushed Bolli to ambush Kjartan, Bolli was trapped. He was caught between his loyalty to his wife and her family, and his deep-seated loyalty and love for his foster brother. In the final confrontation, his hesitation is clear. He does not want to fight Kjartan, but the pressure is too much. He strikes the fatal blow, and in doing so, he breaks the most sacred social bond he has. The killing of a foster brother was a terrible crime. It amplified the tragedy and the shame. It also complicated the path to revenge. Kjartan's father, Olaf, had been Bolli's foster father. He loved Bolli like a son. After Kjartan's death, Olaf refused to pursue vengeance against Bolli. He could not bring himself to harm his own foster son. He arranged a settlement instead, but Kjartan's brothers did not share that bond. Their loyalty was to their blood brother. They felt their father's inaction was a weakness. They ignored the settlement and took matters into their own hands, hunting down and killing Bolli. In fosterage, which was meant to create harmony, had in this case created a set of conflicting loyalties that made the situation impossible to resolve peacefully. Olaf's love for his foster son prevented him from acting, which in turn drove his biological sons to act outside the settlement he had arranged. The feud became more bitter and more personal because it involved the rupture of these deeply felt, chosen relationships. You know, it wasn't just like a clan war, it was a civil war within a family. Number 12, a good horse or a fine sword could get you killed. Viking Age society was highly materialistic, but not in the modern sense. Wealth was not accumulated in banks. It was displayed. A chieftain showed his power and status through the quality of his weapons, the jewelry he wore, the fine clothes he and his family had, and the number and quality of his horses. These were not just possessions, they were symbols of a man's worth and success. Like, gift-giving was a central part of the culture. A good leader was a ring-giver. He rewarded his followers with arm rings of silver and gold, with fine swords, and with well-bred horses. These gifts created bonds of loyalty. To receive a gift from a chieftain was to accept an obligation to him. Because these high-status objects were so important, disputes over them could be deadly. A gift given by a king was a huge mark of honor. To steal such an object was a direct attack on its owner's reputation. We see this clearly in the feud between Kjartan and Bolli from the Laxdæla saga. While Kjartan was in Norway, he won the favor of King Olaf Tryggvason. The king gave him a magnificent sword. The sword was a symbol of the king's favor and of Kjartan's own success abroad. It was a tangible piece of his honor. When Kjartan returned to Iceland, he was bitter about Bolli marrying Guðrún. The feud began to escalate. Guðrún, wanting to strike a blow against Kjartan's pride, decided to steal the one thing that represented his honor most clearly. She had her kinsman steal the king's gift sword. This was not a simple theft. It was a calculated insult. It was a public declaration that Kjartan was not man enough to hold on to his own symbols of status. The theft of the sword was one of the key events that pushed the feud from simmering resentment to open hostility. Kjartan's response, the 3-day siege of Bolli's farm, was a direct result of this act. He was not just angry about a piece of metal. He was angry about the public humiliation that the theft represented. Horses were another major source of conflict. Horse fighting was a popular sport. 2 stallions would be pitted against each other, goaded on by their owners. Men would bet heavily on the outcomes. These were intense, raucous events, and tempers often flared. A dispute over a horse fight could easily lead to a real fight among the owners. In Hrafnkel's saga, the entire story is set in motion by a horse. The chieftain Hrafnkel owned a magnificent stallion named Freyfaxi. He loved this horse so much that he dedicated it to the god Frey. He swore an oath that he would kill any man who rode the horse without his permission. A young shepherd named Einar, who worked for Hrafkel, needed to round up some lost sheep. In a moment of desperation, he took Freyfaxi. When Hrafnkel found out, he felt bound by his own solemn oath. He rode out and killed Einar with his axe. This killing was the spark that ignited a massive feud. Einar's father, a poor man, sought justice. He enlisted the help of his powerful relatives. They brought a case against Hrafnkel at the Althing. Against all odds, they won. Hrafkel was outlawed and driven from his farm. The feud continued for years, with Hrafkel eventually regaining his power and taking his revenge. But The entire bloody saga, which involved multiple killings and the downfall and rise of a great chieftain, all started with a single horse and a proud man's oath. These objects were not just property, they were extensions of a person's identity and honor. To take a man's horse or his sword was to take a piece of his soul, and that was a crime that often had to be answered with blood. Number 11, there was nowhere to hide. So Iceland in the Viking Age was a small and isolated society. The total population was probably only around 60,000 people spread out along the coastal fjords and valleys. The harsh, uninhabitable highlands covered most of the island's interior. People lived in relatively small, tight-knit communities. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew of them. This lack of anonymity had a profound effect on feuds. There was no big city to disappear into. You couldn't just move to the next town and start a new life where no one knew your name. Your name and your family's name was your identity. Your reputation, good or bad, followed you wherever you went. You know, if you were involved in a feud, you know, your enemies were, you know, not strangers. You know, they were your neighbors. You saw them at the local thing assembly. You saw them at seasonal feasts. You might even see them on the path when you went to milk your cows. You were stuck with them. The constant proximity made tensions worse. Every encounter was a potential flashpoint. A sideways glance at the market could be interpreted as a threat. This claustrophobic social environment also meant that public opinion was incredibly powerful. The community acted as a constant audience for the drama of the feud. People would gossip. They would take sides. They would judge your actions. If you failed to avenge a kinsman, everyone in the valley would know it. They would talk about your cowardice. You would be shamed in the eyes of your peers. This social pressure made it very difficult to back down from a conflict. It was often more socially acceptable to continue a bloody feud than to be seen as the one who gave in. The story of Gunnar Hamundarsson's death illustrates this perfectly. When he was sentenced to outlawry, his only real chance of survival was to leave Iceland. But he couldn't do it. His emotional attachment to his home, his land, was too strong. But it was also his social world. To leave Iceland was to leave everyone and everything he had ever known. He chose to stay knowing it was a death sentence. He chose to face his enemies in the community he knew, rather than flee into the anonymous world beyond the sea. Even when a settlement was reached in a feud, the close quarters of the community made it hard for the peace to last. The two families would still be neighbors, they would still have to interact, the memory of the past killings was always there, just below the surface. A new dispute over a stray sheep or a broken fence could easily reignite the old hatred. The oaths of peace sworn at the thing were fragile things in the face of daily contact with the men who had killed your brother. The isolation of the country as a whole also played a role. Iceland was a long and dangerous sea journey from anywhere else. This fostered a strong sense of cultural identity, but it also meant that problems had to be solved internally. There was no outside power to appeal to. There was no king in Norway who could send a sheriff to impose order. The Icelanders had to manage their own conflicts, and their solution, the feud, was shaped by the small, inescapable world they lived in. You could not escape your enemies, you could not escape your reputation, and you could not escape your obligations. Number 10. The gods did not preach forgiveness. Before the conversion to Christianity around the year 1000, the Icelanders followed the Old Norse religion. They worshipped gods like Odin, Thor, and Frey. This was not a religion of peace and forgiveness, it was a religion that reflected the harsh realities of life in the north. The gods themselves were warriors, they fought giants, betrayed each other, and valued courage and strength above all else. The worldview of the pre-Christian Norse people was fatalistic. They believed in the concept of fate, or lorlog. A person's destiny was believed to be spun out by the Norns, three mythical women who controlled the past, present, and future. Your fate was set from the day you were born. While you could face your fate with courage or with cowardice, you could not change it. The best a man could hope for was to die well, to die fighting, and to be remembered in stories and poems. This belief system did not encourage compromise or turning the other cheek. If it was your fate to be killed in a feud, then so be it. The important thing was to meet that fate with honor. To back down from a fight to save your own life would be shameful. It would be seen as trying to cheat your destiny. A heroic death was preferable to a long life of dishonor. Odin was the god of war, poetry, and death. The warriors who died bravely in battle were said to be taken by the Valkyries to Valhalla, Odin's great hall. There, they would feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. This belief provided a powerful incentive to be brave in combat. A glorious death in a feud was a ticket to the best possible afterlife. Thor was the god of strength and order. He protected the world of men and gods from the forces of chaos, the giants. He solved his problems with his hammer, Mjolnir. He was a straightforward god who valued direct action. When insulted, Thor responded with violence, not with negotiation. He was a divine role model for how a man should deal with his enemies. There were no religious commandments against killing in the context of a feud. Vengeance was not seen as a sin, it was seen as a sacred duty. You were honoring your dead kinsman by avenging him. To fail in this duty was a moral failing. The gods would respect a man who fought for his family's honor. They would have contempt for a man who did not. This religious framework provided a moral and spiritual justification for the culture of the feud. It told men that courage in the face of death was the highest virtue. It told them that fate was inescapable. And it told them that vengeance was a righteous act. When Christianity was adopted in Iceland, these old values did not disappear overnight. They continued to influence the culture for centuries. The sagas, though written by Christians, are filled with the echoes of this older, fatalistic, and honor-bound worldview. The heroes of the sagas often seem to know they are doomed. Gisli Sursun is haunted by dreams that foretell his death. Gunnar Hamundarson has a premonition of his own end, but they do not try to run from their fate. They face it, weapon in hand. The old gods might have been gone, but the code of conduct they had sanctioned was much harder to kill. Number 9. Memory was long and forgiveness was short. In a society without widespread literacy, memory was a vital tool. History was not primarily recorded in books. It was recorded in people's minds. The law itself was memorized by the law speaker. Genealogies, which were crucial for establishing inheritance and family alliances, were passed down orally from, one generation to the next. And most importantly, the stories of great deeds and great feuds were preserved in oral tradition. A skilled storyteller could recount the history of his region, naming all the major families and detailing the important events of their past. At feasts and winter gatherings, people would tell stories and recite epic poems about the heroes of old. This was the main form of entertainment, but it was also a way of reinforcing social values. The stories told people what it meant to be brave, what it meant to be honorable, and what it meant to be a good kinsman. This powerful oral culture had a dark side. It meant that grudges were never forgotten. The details of a killing, the insults that were exchanged, the names of the men who were involved, all of this was preserved in the collective memory of the community. A feud was not a fleeting event. It became a story. And as a story, it could be kept alive indefinitely. Guðrún Ósvífursdóttir is a prime example of this. She kept the memory of her husband Bolli's death alive for her sons. She did not let them forget. She showed them the bloody clothes. She told them the story of their father's murder, likely embellishing it to make the killers seem more villainous and their own duty clearer. She was the family historian of the feud. The sagas themselves are a product of this culture. They were first told as oral stories before being written down, mostly in the 13th and 14th centuries. The fact that a writer in the 1200s could recount the detailed events of a feud that happened in the 900s shows how powerful this oral tradition was. The stories were preserved for hundreds of years. This meant that a feud could lie dormant for a generation and then flare up again. A young man would grow up hearing the story of how his grandfather was killed by the men from the next valley. The story would be a part of his identity. he would feel the weight of that old injustice. The men whose grandfather had done the killing would be living right there on the same land. The past was never really past. It was a constant living presence. Forgiveness was not a highly valued virtue in this system. Forgiving an enemy who had killed your kinsman was seen as a form of weakness, a betrayal of the dead. The story of the killing demanded a final chapter, and the only satisfying final chapter was one of vengeance. To forgive was to leave the story unfinished, to let the wrong stand unanswered. The Icelanders had a word, manjafnaður, which meant a comparison of men. People were constantly being compared to their ancestors. A son was expected to be as brave as his father. If a father was a great warrior who always avenged insults, his son was under immense pressure to do the same. If he failed, people would say he was not half the man his father was. The stories of the past set a standard that the living were expected to meet. And those stories were almost always stories of conflict and revenge. Number 8, the Thing was a stage for public humiliation. The Althing and the smaller regional things were the center of public life in Iceland. They were part law court, part festival, and part political convention. For the 2 weeks of the Althing each summer, the Valley of Thingvellir became a temporary city. People set up booths, traded goods, met with friends, and planned political strategies. It was the one time of year when people from all corners of the country came together. Because these assemblies were so public, they were also a stage for the dramas of honor and shame. A legal case was not a quiet affair conducted in a closed room. It was a public performance. The plaintiff and the defendant would stand before the judges, surrounded by a crowd of their peers, and make their arguments. Their supporters would be there, armed and ready. The tension was often high. Winning a case at the Thing was a great victory. It was a public validation of your honor. Losing a case was a public humiliation. It meant that in front of the whole community you had been proven wrong or weak. This public shaming could be just as damaging as a physical wound, and it often led to more violence. Consider the case of Hrothgar, the chieftain who killed his shepherd for riding his horse. The shepherd's father, Thorbjorn, wanted to prosecute the case, but he was a poor man with no power. Hrothgar was a mighty chieftain who had never lost a legal case. He was so powerful that no one dared to stand against him. Thorbjorn went to the Althing and tried to find someone to help him. He was mocked and turned away by several chieftains. It was a humiliating experience. Finally, he found help from his kinsman, Sam. Sam and his brothers, who were enemies of Hrothgar, agreed to take the case. They used their knowledge of the law and their network of allies to outmaneuver Hrothgar. They packed the court with their own men and managed to get Hrothgar convicted and outlawed. For Hrothgar, this was an unimaginable humiliation. He, the great chieftain, had been defeated in his own court by a poor old man and his upstart relatives. The verdict stripped him of his power and his land. He was forced to move and start over in a different valley. This public defeat was a wound that would not heal. Hrothgar spent years rebuilding his power. He was patient. He waited, but he never forgot the humiliation he had suffered at the Althing. When he was strong enough, he took his revenge. He didn't challenge Sam to another lawsuit. He gathered his men, ambushed Sam, and killed him and his followers. He then went to Sam's home, drove his family out, and took back his old farm and his position as chieftain. The legal system, by its very public nature, turned disputes into contests of honor. A verdict was not just a legal ruling, it was a judgment on a man's worth. The loser of a case didn't just lose his claim to some property or have to pay a fine, he lost face. And in a society obsessed with reputation, losing face was intolerable. The shame felt at the Thing often had to be washed away with blood on the journey home. Number 7, alliances dragged everyone into the fight. No, man, not even a powerful chieftain, could stand alone in a feud. Survival and success depended on having allies. A strong kin group was the first and most important source of support, but feuds often grew too large for a single family to handle. To win, a man needed to draw on a wider network of friends, in-laws, and political partners. These alliances were built and maintained through marriage, fosterage, gift-giving, and sworn oaths of mutual support. A chieftain's daughter would be married to the son of another chieftain to create a bond between their families. A man would support his friend in a lawsuit at the thing, with the understanding that the favor would be returned. This created a complex web of obligations that crisscrossed the entire country. When a feud started, the first thing the participants would do is call on their allies. They would ride from farm to farm, reminding their friends and kinsmen of their obligations. Will you ride with me to the thing? Will you support my cause? Will you join me to avenge my brother? This process had a snowball effect. A small dispute between two men could quickly escalate into a large-scale conflict involving dozens or even hundreds of people from different families and different regions. Many of these people had no personal stake in the original argument. They were drawn in because of their duty to an ally. The final section of Njal's saga, which describes the aftermath of the burning of Njal, is a massive story of alliance building. Flosi, who led the attack, knew that Njal's family and their allies would seek a terrible revenge. He immediately began to prepare for the legal and military battle to come. He traveled around Iceland, calling on all the men who owed him a favor. He offered them gifts. He reminded them of their kinship ties. He built a huge coalition of supporters. On the other side, the party seeking vengeance did the same. They were led by Kari, Njal's son-in-law, who had escaped the fire. Kari traveled the country, gathering allies who had been loyal to Njal. The climax came at the Althing. The two massive armies of supporters faced each other across the assembly grounds. The whole nation seemed to be divided into two camps. The legal case was brought forward, but the tension was too high. A fight broke out. It turned into a full-scale battle right there at the seat of law and government. Men were killed on both sides. The Althing, the institution meant to resolve feuds, was nearly destroyed by one. After the battle, a settlement was finally reached. The burners were exiled, but the feud still wasn't over for Kari. He refused to accept the settlement. For him, the duty of personal revenge was stronger than the legal agreement. He spent years hunting down the burners one by one, chasing them across Europe from Norway to the Orkney Islands. This shows how alliances could make a feud impossible to contain. Once a conflict grew beyond the original parties, it took on a life of its own. It became a matter of politics and power, a contest between two great factions, and even if the leaders of the factions could agree to peace, there was no guarantee that every individual within the alliance would accept it. A man like Kari, driven by a personal sense of loss and duty, could continue the fight on his own, ensuring the cycle of violence would not end. Number 6. Wergild was often an insult, not a solution. The system of Wergild, or Mon money, was the cornerstone of the Icelandic legal system's attempt to control feuding. In theory, it was a logical and elegant solution. Every person had a price. If you killed someone, you could settle the matter by paying that price to the victim's family. This would compensate them for their loss and, in theory, satisfy their honor, making a revenge killing unnecessary. The laws in the Gragas were very specific about the amounts. There were standard prices for different classes of people. The money, usually paid in standardized units of silver or homespun cloth, was divided among the family members according to a precise formula. The immediate family received the largest shares, more distant cousins received smaller amounts. This system worked some of the time, especially in cases of accidental death or killings that were seen as justified. But in a heated feud where emotions were high and honor had been deeply wounded, an offer of money could feel like an insult. First, there was the problem of agreeing on the amount. While the law set a standard price, the victim's family often felt their kinsman was worth more. They would demand an extra payment for the shame of the act. The killer's family would refuse. The negotiation itself could become a source of conflict. Second, the act of accepting money could be seen as a sign of weakness or greed. It could look like you were selling your kinsman's blood. Your neighbors might whisper that you cared more about silver than about your family's honor. This social pressure often led families to reject a settlement, even if it was a fair one. They wanted blood, not money, because only blood could truly wash away the stain of the killing. Third, the way the money was offered could be insulting. In Njal's saga, after Njál's sons kill Gunnar's kinsman, a settlement is arranged. The money is gathered. But instead of handing it over respectfully, one of the men involved, Thrain Sigfusson, sneers at Gunnar's family. This arrogant behavior shatters the fragile peace. The offer of money combined with an insult is worse than no offer at all. But the most powerful example of the failure of Wergild comes from Egil's saga. Egil Skallagrimsson's beloved son Bodvar drowns in a shipwreck. Egil is so consumed by grief that he locks himself in his room and refuses to eat, intending to die. His daughter Thorgerd manages to trick him into talking. She convinces him that he should not let his son's memory fade into silence. Instead, he should compose a great poem in his honor, and he should also demand compensation from the man he holds responsible for his son's journey. Egil agrees. He composes the magnificent poem Sonatorek, The Loss of Sons. He then goes to a feast and demands Wergild for Bodvar. The host, a man named Egil's friend, offers him a chest full of silver. He makes a great show of the payment. But Egil is not satisfied. He draws his sword and, in front of everyone, declares that silver can never truly pay for a son. He proclaims that his sword still thirsts for vengeance. Although he eventually accepts the money, his words reveal the deep cultural ambivalence towards the system. Money was a practical solution, but it could never replace a life, it could never heal the grief, it could never fully restore the honor that was lost. The idea of putting a price on a loved one's life was, at its core, a difficult and often insulting concept. And as long as men felt that way, the urge for blood revenge would remain stronger than the desire for a peaceful, paid settlement. Number 5, the geography of isolation bred conflict. The landscape of Iceland is beautiful, but it is also harsh and unforgiving. Much of the country is made up of volcanic deserts, glaciers, and barren highlands. The population was confined to the green, fertile strips of land along the coast and in the valleys. These areas were often separated from each other by mountains, rivers, and lava fields. This geography created pockets of isolated communities. A single fjord or a large valley might be home to several extended families. Travel between these areas was difficult, especially during the long, dark winters. This isolation fostered a strong sense of local identity and loyalty. People felt a stronger connection to their neighbors in the same valley than they did to people from the other side of the country. This same isolation, however, could also breed suspicion and conflict. When a dispute arose between two families in the same valley, it was an internal affair. The rest of the world was far away. The conflict would be played out within the claustrophobic confines of their local community. As we have seen, there was nowhere to run, but the geography also played a role in how feuds were physically conducted. The landscape itself became a strategic element in the fighting. A man who knew the local terrain, the best places to hide, the secret paths through the mountains, the narrow passes that were easy to defend, had a significant advantage. The sagas are filled with detailed descriptions of the landscape because the landscape mattered. An ambush would be set up in a narrow ravine where the targets could not escape. A fugitive outlaw would hide in a cave in the remote highlands. A last stand would be made on a hilltop that was difficult to assault. Gisli Sursen, the outlaw, survived for 13 years in the Westfjords precisely because he was a master of the landscape. He knew every hiding place, every fjord, every glacier. His enemies would hunt for him, but he would use the terrain to evade them. His story is a long and desperate game of hide-and-seek played out across a vast and difficult wilderness. The feud was not just a social conflict, it was a physical struggle with the land itself. The seasons also dictated the rhythm of feuding. For summer was the time for public action. The weather was good for travel, the sea was open, the Althing was in session. This was the time to prosecute lawsuits, to gather allies, and to conduct major raids. Winter was a different story. The snows would close the mountain passes. People were largely confined to their farms. This was a time of tension and danger. It was a time for small-scale, stealthy attacks. A man might be ambushed on his way to a neighbor's farm for a Yule feast. A single traveler was vulnerable. The long winter nights were a time of fear, when a family might huddle in their longhouse, listening for the sound of enemies approaching through the snow. The very structure of the farmstead, the Icelandic longhouse, was designed with defense in mind. It often had thick turf walls and few windows. The doors were strong. When Gunnar Hamundarson made his last stand, he did it from inside his own home. The farmhouse was a fortress. The landscape of Iceland was not a passive backdrop for the feuds. It was an active participant. It isolated communities, created strategic advantages and disadvantages, and dictated the very timing and nature of the violence. Number 4, martial skill was the measure of a man. In Viking Age Iceland, a man was expected to be proficient with weapons. This was not a society with a professional soldier class. Every free farmer was a part-time warrior. From a young age, boys were trained in the use of the axe, the spear, and the sword. They learned to ride horses and to handle a shield. These were not just practical skills for self-defense. They were a core part of a man's education and identity. A man who was a great fighter was admired and respected. The sagas are filled with praise for warriors who are skilled with their weapons, or the best fighter in the district. Our men like Gunnar Hamundarson and Egil Skallagrimsson were famous not just for their property or their legal troubles, but for their incredible prowess in battle. Gunnar was said to be able to jump his own height in full armor. Egil was a berserker, a fierce warrior who could fly into a battle rage. This martial culture meant that violence was always a readily available tool for settling disputes. When a man was insulted, his first thought was often not of the law, but of his axe. A physical confrontation was seen as a legitimate and honorable way to resolve a conflict. To challenge an opponent to a formal duel, a holmgang, was a recognized legal procedure in the early period. The winner of the duel was considered to be in the right. The weapons themselves were prized possessions. A good sword was incredibly expensive and was often given a name. It would be passed down from father to son as a family heirloom. To lose a family sword was a great shame. To own a famous sword like Kjartan's gift from the king was a great honor. The weapons were a constant physical reminder of a man's role as a warrior. This focus on martial skill created a social hierarchy based on fighting ability. A man who was known to be a poor fighter was at a distinct disadvantage. He was more likely to be bullied or have his rights infringed upon, because people knew he was unlikely to respond with effective violence. A man known to be a deadly warrior was treated with respect and caution. His reputation was his shield. This created a dangerous dynamic in a feud. When two men or two groups faced each other, their reputations as fighters were on the line. To back down was to admit that you were the weaker party. This was a public admission of inferiority. Therefore, even a small confrontation could quickly escalate, as neither side wanted to be the one to lose face by retreating. The stories often describe fights in great detail, focusing on the skill and bravery of the combatants. A good death was as important as a good life. To die fighting against overwhelming odds was the mark of a true hero. The story of Gunnar's last stand is celebrated not because he won, but because of how he fought and died. He single-handedly held off dozens of attackers, killing many of them before he was finally overwhelmed. His death was a testament to his supreme skill as a warrior. This cultural glorification of combat meant that there was very little social or moral restraint on the use of violence. While there were rules of engagement, it was considered shameful to attack a man in his sleep without warning, for example. The act of fighting itself was seen as honorable. A feud was a chance for a man to prove his worth, to show his courage, and to create a story that would be told about him for generations. In such a culture, peace was always going to be a difficult sell. Number 3, escalation was a vicious, unstoppable logic. Feuds rarely began with a killing. They started small, a casual insult, a dispute over a piece of driftwood, a fight between two servants, but these small events were governed by a terrible, unstoppable logic of escalation. Each act of retaliation had to be slightly more severe than the act that provoked it. This was necessary to show that you were not weak and to discourage further aggression. But it also guaranteed that the conflict would grow, step by step, until it was completely out of control. The servant killings in Njál's saga are the classic textbook example of this process. The feud begins at a feast, where the wives of the two best friends, Gunnar and Ingjal, trade insults. The Hallgerd, Gunnar's wife, is proud and vindictive. Bergthora, Njal's wife, is equally proud and stubborn. To avenge Hallgerd's insult to her husband, Bergthora has one of her servants kill one of Hallgerd's servants. It is a minor event. The victim is a man of low status. Ingjal is horrified and immediately offers Gunnar full compensation, which Gunnar accepts. The two friends are determined to not let their wives' quarrel come between them, but Hallgerd cannot let it go. Her honor has been slighted. She now has one of her kinsmen kill one of Bergthora's servants. This is a step up. A kinsman is of higher status than a servant. Again, Gunnar is ashamed and pays full compensation to Ingjal. Now it is Bergthora's turn. She must respond to the killing of her servant by a kinsman of Hallgerd. So she gets two of her own kinsmen to kill an even more important follower of Hallgerd. The cycle continues back and forth. Each killing is a little more serious than the last. The victims get more important. The perpetrators get more directly connected to the two main families. The husbands, Gunnar and Njal, are caught in the middle. They keep trying to patch things up. After every killing, they meet and exchange money. So they swear their friendship will endure. But they are powerless to stop the logic of escalation. Their wives are driving the feud, and the honor of their households is at stake. They cannot control their own families. The final straw comes when Thor, the foster father of Njal's sons, is killed by Gunnar's kinsman. This is no longer a servant or a minor follower. This is a member of the family. At this point, Njal's sons, the Skarfadinsons, can no longer be restrained. The system of compensation breaks down. They want blood. They ride out and kill several of Gunnar's relatives. This leads to Gunnar himself being prosecuted at the Althing, which leads to his outlawry and his death. What began with a few sharp words between two women at a party has escalated step by step into a series of killings that destroys one of the greatest heroes in Iceland and shatters the friendship of the two most respected men in the country. This pattern is repeated in many sagas. A small spark is fanned by the winds of honor and social pressure. Each side adds a little more fuel to the fire with its response. The fire grows until it becomes a raging inferno that consumes everyone involved. The logic is simple and brutal, an eye for an eye, but your eye must be slightly bigger than mine. It is a recipe for disaster. Number 2. The thirst for a good story was stronger than the desire for peace. The people of Viking Age Iceland were connoisseurs of stories. As we've seen, the sagas were their literature, their history, and their entertainment. A person's life was judged not just by what they did, but by the quality of the story it would make. A long, peaceful, and prosperous life was good, but it made for a boring tale. A short, violent, and tragic life filled with conflict, betrayal, and a heroic death made for a great story. And a great story granted a form of immortality. The heroes of the sagas seem to be aware of this. They often act as if they know they are characters in a drama. They deliver witty, memorable lines before a fight. They compose poetry on their deathbeds. They make choices that are strategically foolish but dramatically perfect. They seem to choose the path that will lead to the best story. When Gunnar Hamundarson turns back from his journey into exile because the hillside of his home looks so fair, it is a terrible decision from a practical point of view. How it guarantees his death, but it is a magnificent dramatic moment. It is the action of a tragic hero who is tied to his homeland by a bond stronger than his own life. It ensures that the story of his last stand will be told for 1,000 years. When Skarfadin and Jalson is dying in the burning longhouse, he carves a cross into the wall and then collapses. His enemies later find his body. He is not burned. The wall had collapsed on him and protected him. He is standing upright against the wall, his eyes open, a grim smile on his face. This is not a realistic description of a death. It is a carefully crafted image designed to show his unbreakable spirit even in death. It is a storyteller's ending. This desire to be the subject of a good story created a powerful incentive to continue feuds. A peaceful settlement, a quiet compromise, a decision to forgive and forget these actions do not make for a compelling narrative. A relentless pursuit of vengeance, a dramatic last stand against impossible odds, a life lived on the edge of violence, that is the stuff of legend. A man who pursued a feud with courage and determination would be remembered. His name would be recited in genealogies. His deeds would be celebrated in poems. He would become a character, an ancestor to be proud of. A man who chose peace over honor risked being forgotten. This is perhaps the most insidious reason why feuds were so hard to stop. They were not just social or legal conflicts. They were the raw material from which the culture created its most important art form, the saga. The feud generated the stories that told the Icelanders who they were. The violence was tragic, but it was also the source of the culture's greatest pride. The people listening to these stories in the 13th century were the descendants of the characters. The stories validated their own identities and their claims to their land. The feuds of the past were not just tales of senseless violence. They were the founding myths of their own families, and as long as people wanted to hear a good story, there would be a cultural pressure to act in a way that created one. Number 1, honor was not a choice, it was gravity. At the heart of every other reason lies one single, inescapable concept: honor. In the modern world, we think of honor as a personal virtue, a matter of individual conscience. In Viking Age Iceland, it was something different. It was an external, public commodity. It was your reputation, your social standing, your worth in the eyes of your peers. It was the sum total of how you were perceived by the community, and it was more valuable than life itself. A man's honor was not static. It could be gained and lost. You gained honor through brave deeds, generosity, and success in conflict. You lost honor through cowardice, weakness, or by failing to respond to a challenge. Everything a person did was measured against this single standard. This is the key to understanding why feuds were so intractable. An insult or an injury in a feud was not just a personal attack. It was a public challenge to your honor. If you were slapped or if your kinsman was killed, a certain amount of honor was stripped from you and your family. There was now a deficit. The only way to restore that honor, to bring the scales back into balance, was to retaliate. You had to respond with an action of equal or greater force. To choose not to respond was to accept the loss of honor. It was to publicly agree that you were weaker, less worthy than your opponent. This was social death. A man without honor had no influence. He could not rely on his neighbors for support. His word was worthless. He was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. His family would share in his shame. His daughters would be difficult to marry off. His sons would be mocked. This is why men in the sagas make choices that seem irrational to us. Why did Gunnar stay and die rather than accept exile? Because to leave would have been to flee, and his honor would not allow it. Why did Flosi burn in Jarl and his family in their home, even though he knew it was a terrible deed? Because his kinswoman, Hildegun, had publicly challenged his honor and left him no other choice. Why did men fight to the death over a few stolen trees or a slanderous poem? Because those were not the real stakes. The real stake was always honor. Honor was not an abstract idea. It had real-world consequences. It was the currency of power. A man with great honor could command the loyalty of many followers. A man with no honor had none. In a society without a strong central government, this public reputation was the only thing that guaranteed your safety and your family's prosperity. You could not opt out of the system. It was like gravity. It affected everyone all the time. Whether you were a powerful chieftain or a humble farmer, you were subject to its laws. A feud was a crisis of honor, and once it began, the path was laid out. The rules of honor dictated the next move. It required retaliation. It demanded that debts of blood be paid. To ignore these rules was not an option, any more than a man could choose to ignore the need for food or air. All the other reasons, the lack of a king, the flaws in the law, the social pressure, the role of women, the importance of land and family. They were all just different aspects of this one central force. The feud was a machine, and honor was its engine, and once that engine was started, it was almost impossible to turn off until it had run its course, usually leaving a trail of broken bodies and shattered lives in its wake.